This wasn't a random event. This was a targeted assassination.
A family man gunned down in his own home.
There was a large amount of blood.
Numerous bullet wounds to his torso and head.
He was probably dead before he hit the floor.
A laundry list of suspects with motive for murder.
I was concerned about her description of the shooter being very cliche-ish, almost like a TV movie.
He's a con man. He goes by different names. So red flags are popping up all over the place.
Rin over his head.
The truth will be revealed.
What this came down to was greed. Every one of them was convinced that these two were somehow involved.
I've been a homicide detective for a long time, and oftentimes you just try to find the lie.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Spokane, Washington, an idyllic town nestled in the lush green mountains of the Pacific Northwest.
Spokane is a city of approximately 300,000 people. It's surrounded by mountains and farm country. Beautiful, with a river running right through the middle of town. It is a great place to raise a family and to make a life.
We don't have a lot of crime. We aren't like the big cities where we're going out on homicides every night.
But on a quiet December night, the peace of this town is shattered by...
Oh God, he's going to find me.
At 7:03 p.m., Alberta Carlisle called 911 reporting that someone had just shot her husband, Doug. Alberta, when she called in, it was right after she made it to a closet, locked herself in, and was hiding. And she called immediately. She had her phone with her. So we knew that this had happened within a minute or two of the call.
Officers arrived on scene. Medics came in and immediately began working on him. They pronounced him dead at 7:18 in the evening.
A-year-old businessman, devoted husband, and father of 6.
Douglas, he was a family man. He'd been married to his wife, Alberta, for 42 years. This was the love of her life. She knew everything that he did. They were always together. I got the impression that this had broken her. They had grown children, very religious family. From all outward appearances, a completely normal person. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't causing trouble.
He'd had his own excavation business in Washington and had expanded that business to include the...
Within minutes of the 911 call, homicide detectives are on the scene.
It was a very affluent neighborhood, and this was one of the larger houses in the neighborhood. I was surprised when I was told the address of where the homicide had occurred, because typically we might go 20 or 30 years without having a homicide in those type of neighborhoods in Spokane.
Tasked with investigating the murder of Doug Carlisle are veteran homicide detectives Mark Burbridge and Brian Sesnick.
When I first entered the home, there was Christmas stuff all over. There was actually Christmas music playing over the stereo, and they were obviously ready for the holidays. The deceased, Mr. Carlisle, was lying on his back, his arms out to the side. One round had gone in his mouth.
Doug had numerous bullet wounds to his torso and head.
There was a large amount of blood. It was obvious that the wounds had been fatal almost immediately. He was probably dead before he hit the floor.
Detectives begin processing the crime scene, looking for clues.
Initially, there wasn't a lot of evidence. I found 7. 5 of the bullets exited him, so I found 5 bullets in the house. 2 more were recovered at the autopsy.
The .45 caliber handgun had been fired at Mr. Carlisle. The subject had emptied the handgun. He had almost no chance to survive those wounds for any period of time. This was a directed attack, and they fired it to make sure he was dead.
To track down the killer, detectives must now focus on the last 24 hours of Doug Carlisle's life, beginning with the moment he arrived home at 6:55 p.m.
Alberta, she removed their hidden key, which she used to enter the house. She put the key back in position, walked through the kitchen to a short hallway which leads to the upstairs. She was just getting to the second floor when she heard voices downstairs. She heard two males talking in the kitchen, and she knew one of them was Doug, and she just assumed that one of them was one of her four sons. And so she came back downstairs to see who was at the house. She came to the bottom of the stairs and stepped to the entryway to the kitchen, and she looked to her right, and near the kitchen table was what she described as a large male dressed all in black with a black stocking mask on with a hole in it. She could see the subject's eyes and nose and part of their mouth, and that they were holding a large handgun. Alberta said that they also had something on their chest and back, like a backpack or a shoulder holster, and that she turned around and started running. As she was running up the stairs, she heard a lot of gunshots. She didn't know the number. And that she ran upstairs and hid in one of the closets. And from a closet she was hiding in, and directed police to their location.
Detectives must first entertain the theory that Doug's murder could have been a burglary gone wrong.
I examined all the doors, all the windows, took photographs. There was a spare key to the house that Alberta talked about. I found that it was still in the same location it had been. So there's nothing to indicate that anyone had broken into the house at all.
I could find no sign that anything had been stolen or disturbed in the residence.
Douglas Carlisle still had his wallet. He had cash on him, so it wasn't a robbery that his dog had tracked. Basically, it showed that the suspect had fled the back door of the residence, through some shrubs, over a small fence, and through the neighbor's backyard. It was cool out, but not frozen. There's some water in the neighbor's backyard, and you could see footprints in the mud. Just beyond the neighbor's backyard was a field where we located a glove. It was a tan-colored welding glove. Normally that wouldn't be a big deal, but there was some dew on the ground and leaves had fallen, and this appeared to be sitting on top of everything and was dry. It was strange enough that there was no way we were going to leave it.
At a minimum, I was hoping to get a DNA sample from the glove that went to the shooter or someone that was at the scene who has been arrested before, so that I can identify them by name. Our K-9 was able to track the suspect past a school. We were later able to get the video from the external cameras on that school, and we could see a grainy figure running down the street just a minute or so after the shooting, leading off into the darkness toward the hidden trail. This camera was not a low-light camera, and so the footage just shows a grain. After looking at the getaway route, taking into account the hedges, the hidden gate, and the kind of hidden trail that the shooter took to get away from the scene, I told Detective Sesnick that I believed this was a directed attack, specifically targeting Doug Carlisle, and I was very concerned.
This wasn't a random event. This was a targeted assassination.
Detectives now consider whether this could have been an inside job.
Family members or people you know kill you more often than a random, unknown person. And so I had to eliminate the family first.
Los, who was not only at the murder scene, but claimed to have seen the suspect. But the suspect didn't go after her. So that drew a lot of red flags for me. I was thinking, is this someone who's trying to pull something over my eyes? Or is she really the loving wife.
Alberta provided a fairly detailed description of the shooter's clothing and the mask and some kind of gear that they had on their chest and back. I was concerned about her description of the shooter being very cliche-ish, almost like a TV movie, and it concerned me that it was being made up.
A story that is too detailed is you have either hired or convinced someone to do her dirty work for her.
In the brutal murder of 63-year-old business and family man Doug Carlisle, suspicion is swirling around his wife, Alberta.
My first interview with Alberta Carlisle occurred at approximately 8:30 in the evening to 9 o'clock in the evening. The shooting had occurred around 6:30.
Alberta Carlisle, she is different. There's a lot of religion that comes out. She would occasionally break down crying and she'd want to pray and things like that. She's very emotional. And that comes across like she's faking it.
So Alberta's reaction in her interview to revert to prayer and sort of these soliloquies and speaking to herself and to God is obviously suspicious and piques the curiosity of investigators. This could mean one of two things. This is a stress response where she's seeking some kind of solace through prayer.
As a homicide detective, I've interviewed a lot of people who have had loved ones die from a murder. I've seen the whole gamut of emotion from that, from very stoic, almost non-emotion to hysterical crying. I try not to read a lot into that, but some of the things that Alberta said and some of her actions concerned me greatly. She didn't care about us processing the scene or getting evidence. Saying goodbye to Doug was more important to her than us catching the killer.
Detectives question potential motives that Alberta would have to want her husband dead.
A lot of what I had seen was just for show. They didn't have $40 in the bank. They didn't have any life insurance. They didn't have medical insurance. I'd had a chance to go through his phone. There wasn't another woman on the side. She didn't have anyone on the side. Basically, every text message and call was, "I love you," back and forth between them. And so once I ruled out that there was a financial incentive for her to be involved, I really believed her when she talked about how in love they were and how things were going between them.
Still grasping for a lead, detectives press Alberta to
Alberta started telling me that she thought she had seen a van earlier in the night up in the neighborhood.
One of the neighbors had called 911 a short time before the shooting, talking about a suspicious white van. About 5:45 in the afternoon, she had come home and noticed a white van parked in front of her house. It was in front of her driveway, and she immediately became concerned, thinking maybe someone had broken into her house. So instead of pulling into her home, she had driven around the block and noticed someone sitting in the driver's seat of the van. When this person noticed her watching, they drove off. On one to report a suspicious vehicle.
Was the mysterious white van connected to Doug's murder? Looking for answers, police canvassed the Carlisle's neighborhood.
One of the homes had an external video system, and we actually had videotape footage of this suspicious van about 2 hours prior to the murder, driving through the neighborhood slowly. The van was unique in several ways in that it was an aftermarket extended van, and one of my detectives spent almost 2 weeks trying to identify specifically the make and model of that van. And in the state of Washington, we can run surrounding counties that match that van, and we came up with a list of 75.
Though detectives believe they may have images of what could have been the getaway vehicle, they're no closer to knowing the identity of the killer.
While I was talking with Alberta, obviously the big question in my mind is who would want your husband dead? And I asked her point blank, who are possible suspects? You've seen the person who shot him. Who else could be involved in this? And the only name that she ever mentioned was James Henriksen.
Alberta told me that Doug was very afraid of James, who was one of his business partners.
Developer in the burgeoning oil sector, Doug Carlisle had partnered with James Henriksen in a venture to extract oil in North Dakota.
James was a businessman in North Dakota. He owned a trucking company hauling water and oil out on the oil leases of North Dakota.
There's a lot of similarities between James and Doug. They both liked people to believe that they were rich. They both drove nice vehicles, had nice houses, liked to show it off, liked to pretend that they had a lot of money. And the fact is, neither of them did. Both were living well beyond their means.
On the relationship between Doug and James.
Every one of them was convinced that James was somehow involved in this murder, and that it had to do with the fact that their dad and James Henriksen were not getting along, and their business was going south.
Doug's eldest son reveals that the animosity between Doug and James had reached a fever pitch in the days prior to his murder.
Doug and James Henriksen got into a verbal argument about the finances of the company. James Henriksen was demanding his investment back. It was a significant sum of money, He was concerned enough for their father's well-being that they gave him a handgun that belonged to them so he could carry it for his safety. It is not uncommon for people that are potentially going to lose large sums of money based on either fraud, theft, or just bad business to resort to murder, either to recover their money or just to get even or pay the person back for costing them their money. In my experience, I've seen people kill people over $50. So hundreds of thousands of dollars is certainly something that someone might kill somebody over.
Detectives are zeroing in on a new suspect in the murder of family man Doug Carlisle, his business partner, James Henriksen.
So early on, every family member is saying James Henriksen is involved in this. I just started Googling James Henriksen, and one of the first things that popped up was this ripoff report. He's a con man, he goes by different names. So red flags are popping up all over the place. And so, yeah, with his criminal history and everything that we knew about James at that point, that's when we decided we've got to try and talk to him.
And to see if anything that the Carlisle family members had told me was potentially true. On the night of Doug's murder, after I had completed interviewing Alberta and her sons, they had provided to me contact information for James Henriksen to include his address and cell phone number. I contacted police radio and arranged for them to ping James Henriksen's cell phone so I could locate where that cell phone was prior to me trying to contact him. After about 20 minutes, I received a phone call from police radio who told me that that phone was being identified as being back in Watford on the phone. I identified who I was and told him I was calling because Doug Carlisle had been murdered. James Henriksen told me he was aware that Doug had been murdered because he had received texts from several people that he and Doug had in common as friends who were telling him that Doug had been murdered.
He denied having anything to do with the murder.
James Henriksen was guarded in his disclosures of information to me about Doug Carlisle. I was asking him about how his business was doing, and he became angry and denied that there were any problems between he and Doug Carlisle. Bills. I've been a homicide detective for a long time, and oftentimes you just try to find the lie that helps lead you down the correct path. And in this case, I either had the Carlisle family that was lying or I had James Henriksen that was lying, and now I had to find evidence to bolster which side was telling the truth. While I was speaking with James on the phone, I wasn't comfortable that he was actually in North Dakota. In this day and age with cell phones, you can forward another cell phone to another cell phone or to a hard line at some residence. So he could have been in Spokane talking to me on a phone.
Cell phones are a really interesting investigative tool. The use of tower pings can essentially leave a trail of breadcrumbs confirming where a person has been or has gone. At the same time, a very calculating suspect could put a phone in a car, leave a phone on a subway, or send their phone with somebody else in order to lead investigators into a completely different area. In essence, a phone can be used to fabricate an alibi.
I later completed search warrants to get complete phone information from his phone, because if you get the actual background information, and I was able to determine that it was not forwarded and was actually in North Dakota, 1,000 miles away from Doug's murder. That told me that he was not the murderer.
At that point, we didn't have any concrete evidence. We didn't have anything linking him to the scene.
Unable to put James at the crime scene, detectives ask him who might be angry enough to want Doug dead.
He told me that over the years, Doug, in his contracting business, had been sued a lot of times and had done a lot of shady deals, and there might be a lot of people that were mad at him that might be willing to hurt him.
Upset with him and that would have a reason to murder him.
Detectives dig deeper into Doug's business dealings and discover a desperate man hell-bent on success.
Doug borrowed $150,000 from his son Shane. Doug was promising investors 100% return on their money in 90 days or 6 months, depending on who the investor was, which was ridiculous.
Every dime that he had been invested in the business, and they were not bringing any money in. The business was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, loans from people up to $400,000, and promised repayment. Those had come past due, so people were upset, wanting their money back. He was in dire financial straits.
He had contacted a middleman in the Middle East who was reportedly involved in finding investors for oil companies. This individual charged Mr. Carlisle $90,000 for the right to apply for an investment loan. This was pure fraud, and this individual had no intent of conducting any true business with Mr. Carlisle, so Mr. Carlisle lost.
Risky business deals with shady operators. Doug got himself, in plain English, in over his head.
I was going to have to expand the pool of possible suspects to everybody that was involved in lawsuits against him.
That leaves a very long list of potential suspects with very viable motives. Money is more than just dollars and cents. Money has a high degree of emotional attachment for people. It's tied to everything from self-esteem to status to identity. And when you begin tampering with that, people will, not surprisingly, respond emotionally, including through murder.
So many suspects with the motive to want Doug Carlisle dead. Detectives reach out to the media looking for new leads.
I had put out a request in the media for persons that knew Doug Carlisle or James Henriksen to contact us if they'd had business dealings with them. Out of the blue, about a week after Doug's murder, an individual by the name of Robert DeLeo contacted me at the police station and said that he'd had business dealings with both James Henriksen and Doug Carlisle and was willing to speak with me.
Robert DeLeo is a very smooth-talking guy, but he's a gang member, and he'd been to prisons numerous times. He denied having anything to do with the murder. He denied that James had anything to do with the murder, but he felt that he needed to come in and let us know his relationship.
Suspicious of DeLeo's motive for coming forward, investigators question him about his whereabouts when Doug Carlisle was killed.
He told us he was in North Dakota at the time of the murder. We checked phone records, we checked GPS records, and we confirmed he was in North Dakota, which is what his girlfriend told us.
Mr. DeLeo was insistent he knew nothing about the murders, and in fact,
Despite DeLeo's alibi and polygraph, something just doesn't sit right with detectives.
I thought it was very odd that Mr. DeLeo came forward just to provide information that he knew Doug Carlisle or James Henriksen.
Psychologically speaking, I think there might be a number of reasons why somebody would want to insert themselves into an investigation. One reason might be, I want to get close to the investigation. I want to control it. I want to know what's going on.
We often see them show up, for instance, in volunteer search parties where a body hasn't been found. And they want to keep abreast of what's going on so that they can stay a step or two ahead.
They don't necessarily have the best judgment, and sometimes they make decisions that are ill-advisable. Sometimes they do this because they're arrogant.
After Mr. DeLeo left my interview room, I began working on a search warrant to include his cell phone, who they had been calling and texting, to try to create some kind of a connection between Mr. DeLeo, Mr. Henriksen, and anybody that might be involved in this murder.
Investigators then make a shocking discovery: that James Henriksen shared a similar criminal past with Robert DeLeo.
Robert DeLeo was James Henriksen's right-hand man. Later ended up in jail together, ended up being cellmates. While sitting in jail, Henriksen told Robert DeLeo about his business ventures and his dreams of striking it rich in North Dakota, and told him, when you get out of jail, get a hold of me, I got a job for you.
But what was that job? Looking for answers, investigators do a deep dive into James Henriksen's partnership with Doug Carlisle. They discover the business was in desperate need of a bailout from an angel investor.
Doug had developed this dream of being an oil man and owning an oil, and he was trying to find partners to buy this oil lease for $2.1 million. Doug did not have that kind of money.
Luckily, Doug and James knew a contractor named Larry Tormazov with connections to big money.
Mr. Tormazov was personal friends with a gentleman in Moses Lake who was involved in the contracting business and who was very wealthy. Mr. Tormazov was then contacted by James Henriksen, where they discussed the possibility of this wealthy individual becoming involved in the oil lease. James Henriksen stood to make a lot of money, desperately running out of time to make that happen, or they were going to lose everything. And so he needed this wealthy individual to help fund this project.
There was just one problem.
Mr. Tormazov said that he told James Henriksen, under no uncertain terms would this person get involved as long as Doug Carlisle was involved, because of his previous dealings with him. Mr. Tormazov told me that this made James Henriksen very angry.
Turns out, the only thing standing between James Henriksen and millions of dollars is Doug Carlisle.
Money is always a motivation for murder. I mean, when the stakes...
They say is the root of all evil. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but is it a common denominator in a majority of murders? Unfortunately, yes. When you have a trail of bad debts and damaged business relationships, greed is going to push to the top in Doug's case.
What investigators learn next cracks the case wide open.
Doug found an investor who lived in Texas, who had a lot of money, who was willing to invest in this land. He'd done the research, he knew that there was a lot of money in it. Doug had convinced this person that really they didn't need James, but he needed the following day in order to work out the finances to buy James out and to actually begin working on drilling oil wells.
Turns out Doug was murdered just days before he was set to cut James out of the business. If James had caught wind of the plan, he'd have even more motive to want Doug dead.
We're trying to piece everything together. DeLeo had been in North Dakota since at least Thanksgiving. He hadn't been back to Spokane. We knew Henriksen had been in North Dakota consistently even longer than that. Neither of them had been to town recently, which again creates issues when these are your two suspects.
DNA is pulled from the glove found at the crime scene.
25 days after the murder, I received a phone call from the State Patrol Crime Lab and was told that they had a hit to an individual by the name of Tim Suko.
When we first hear the name Timothy Suko, I got very excited, but it was hampered a little bit by we'd never heard that name before. And it came off a glove that I found in a field. What if it's just a coincidence? What if Timothy Suko is the next door neighbor? We didn't know who it was at that point.
I immediately began researching Timothy Suko and found that he was a and that he lived in the Spokane area. I started looking for Timothy Suko's connection to anybody associated with Doug Carlisle because he didn't know Doug and didn't have a motive for killing him.
Knowing there's a small crime world in Spokane, detectives start piecing together a potential conspiracy to commit murder. Could Timothy Suko have been hired to kill Doug Carlisle?
Robert DeLeo was also a true bad guy in Spokane. He comes across as very gregarious and friendly, but he's dangerous. And what was his real involvement with James Hendrickson? I believe we had a true hitman case.
Investigators now theorize James Hendrickson masterminded the murder of Doug Carlisle by hiring Robert DeLeo to contract out the job to local criminal Timothy Suko.
Murder-for-hire schemes are fortunately fairly rare. Most people act impulsively and do their own dirty work. Whoever's concocted this murderous scheme simply doesn't want to get their hands dirty or wants to leave themselves an alibi. So the key to finding them in that case is to find the person who did have the motive and ideally linking them to the killer.
So the first thing we do is try and connect Timothy Suko to James Hendrickson and Robert DeLeo, but he doesn't connect to any of them.
Detectives place Timothy Suko on 24-hour undercover surveillance.
We begin following Timothy Suko around, trying to find out everything we can about him. We find out that he works for an asbestos removal company in the Spokane Valley. As we start looking at the company, we see some vans parked out front.
I checked our list of 75 vehicles that we received from the state of Washington as potential owners of those suspect vehicles, and that asbestos removal company was listed as an owner of one of those matching vans. I had undercover detectives go out and view that van, and that van had some very unique identifying marks on it, which exactly matched the van at the crime scene. I was very certain that this was the vehicle used in the murder of Doug Carlisle.
While the evidence connecting Timothy Suko to the crime scene is strong, it's not enough to charge him with Doug Carlisle's murder.
Timothy Suko had left his cell phone at home because he didn't want to be tracked. He knew a little bit about how police worked. His driver got bored and turned his phone back on and was playing on the phone while he was waiting. So we were able to place the van and the driver at the scene for about 2 hours beforehand.
With the evidence now stacked against him, Timothy Suko is arrested for the murder of Doug Carlisle.
Not only do we have DNA linking this person there, we find no other reason for him to be in that area, and now we have our van that was used as the getaway van. So we start putting everything together and we bring him in.
He was in denial, refused to speak with me, and in fact, he fell asleep on the interview room table.
Back in basic homicide school, you learn that when someone's done a serious crime, they're constantly looking over their shoulder. They have trouble sleeping. They're waiting for the police to show up knocking at their door. So when you arrest someone and you tell them they're under arrest and you know they did it, all that pressure's off now. And it's not uncommon for suspects to fall asleep. And so we knew we had our guy.
I got a search warrant to access Tim's phone, and in that phone was James Henriksen's name, I knew that at least in some way, Tim Suko knew James Henriksen directly.
About an hour after the murder, Timothy Sukow sent a text message to Robert DeLeo saying, "Tell the boss to watch the news." This was obviously letting Henriksen know that he had carried out the murder.
At this point in the investigation, I've got an overwhelming amount of evidence that's pointing toward Mr. DeLeo and Mr. Henriksen's involvement in Mr. Carlisle's murder.
Detectives haul Robert DeLeo into the station for questioning.
I told Mr. DeLeo table to provide information. Ultimately, DeLeo admitted to brokering the murder of Doug Carlisle for James Henriksen.
With the confession that James Henriksen was responsible for the hit on Doug Carlisle, detectives are able to piece together his final 24 hours.
Timothy Sukow had been up at the house for a couple hours, waiting for the Carlisles to return home. They'd been at a church function that began at about 5 o'clock. They drove home, parked their car probably about 6:55 in the evening.
They entered the residence, voices in the house. So she came back downstairs to see who was there. She actually saw the shooter and saw him with a gun.
At 7:02, Timothy Sukow shot Doug Carlisle 7 times and ran away. At 7:03 p.m., Alberta Carlisle called 911, reporting that someone had just shot her husband.
18 in the evening.
Timothy Sukow then disposed of the murder weapon.
Timothy Sukow had driven out to the Spokane Valley, out to a bridge, and tossed the murder weapon into the river.
My biggest takeaway in this case is that Doug is not unlike a lot of investors who has this sort of modest demeanor or veneer, and he likes to take risks in financial games. And when they begin losing money, the stakes are even higher than I think Doug and a lot of these people initially guessed.
To 22 years in prison.
Mr. DeLeo is a sociopath who has no guilt feelings about anything he's done.
Timothy Sukow pleads guilty to murder and receives a sentence of 30 years.
He's going to be like 80 years old if he ever sees daylight again. So basically, it's a death sentence he got, so I think his sentence was fair, provided the information he gave and the help he gave to the case to get the actual person that I believe is responsible.
James Henriksen is found guilty of murder for hire and sentenced to life in prison.
This was a case where we took down some murders. What this came down to was greed. James saw a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and he was willing to kill anyone who got between him and that money. And Doug Carlisle was going to buy him out, and he wasn't going to get that money, so he had him killed. It was all about money. It was all about greed.
This case was the most complicated case that I've ever worked on. It meant a lot to the Carlisle family that I was able to bring this case to resolution. I received phone calls from every son from Alberta thanking me.
It's a truly innocent victim in this case, and the people involved are sitting in prison where they deserve to be.
At People magazine, this story dominates our headlines.
Her plan is to give Kelsey a poisoned macchiato. You could not make this up.
People magazine investigates, all new Mondays at 10 on ID and Discovery Plus, the streaming home of true crime.